Okay guys, good morning. My name's Mark Macrae and I'm here on the community track. This was originally going to be an IT Pro session, but due to the volume of sessions submitted for that track, it's put it down to the community track. But what I aim to give, as well as just an IT Pro, is some sort of experience from my consulting experience setting up reporting services through different environments, ranging from sort of single server environments right to fully kind of scaled out large deployments. So it's a IT Pro architects, administrators session. It's aimed at those kind of roles. And what I'm aiming to do is to really step through how to set it up, how to configure it, and give you guys an idea of what's involved, sort of skill sets required, common problems, and really my experience and what's good practice and what I've seen as being bad practice. A little bit about myself. Few logos up there, a few chuckles. I've worked with SharePoint since 2003, really. Currently a director of a consulting services company in Nottingham, Intelligent Decisioning. I'm a SharePoint user group organiser for the Midlands region, so we hold sort of regular events up in Nottingham, probably every couple of months. So if you're ever up that way, do drop in or see me afterwards for some details. And a few things about me outside work. The Krav Maga is like a self-defence. That's really for when I go supporting West Ham. But also kind of spend a lot of my time in community events. So I'm a football coach for kids as well, under 7. So I get grief from the missus on how much community time I spend and how little family time. So the aims of the session really break down reporting services integration with SharePoint. So have a look at the technology, really break it down into sort of its base components, so we get a real good understanding of what's involved. Some best practices for installation and configuring it. Lessons learned from my experiences, pain points, late nights. Look at the different kinds of setups that we can have. So from topologies through to different authentication, scale out. How have other companies set this up? So I can give you some kind of real examples of how various types of organisation have set this up, and a couple of tips along the way about performance. So why reporting services? Well, a lot of organisations use this. It's a really good BI tool. It's one of the BI stack components that doesn't require enterprise level SharePoint. So a lot of companies have got just SharePoint Foundation or Windows SharePoint Services. They deploy reporting services because it gives them a real rich graphical interface, and it's a really good reporting tool. And with the latest version of SQL Server, it's more than just tabular style reports. And seeing BI in general, really becoming more prevalent in the workplace now. So let's have a quick overview of the technology, what's involved in reporting services. So essentially, reporting services has always been a component of SQL Server, and historically it's sat on its own. You've configured it in native mode, and there's been a sort of a management console, which was a web interface for creating your reports, managing who can see and edit those reports. And as SharePoint's come on board, there was obviously the need to integrate reporting services with SharePoint and let SharePoint manage those reports. And that's really essentially where the integration points are. And these two components, so you've got your Windows SharePoint Services component, which is your SharePoint servers, your web front ends, and then you've got a report server, which is a separate component. Now this can either live on the SharePoint server or it can be a separate server. but they're both web front-end technologies. So there's a common misconception that reporting services is, a SQL Server component and therefore should be installed and deployed on your SQL Server, and that's not the case. Okay, it's an endpoint, it's a web front end for users to hit to access reports. So essentially, it's a web front end technology. So there's some bits that you would install for the SQL Server side. There's obviously some bits that you would install and configure on the SharePoint side, and then there's an add-in that sits in between that joins the two together. And the add-in, up here you can see, when you install the reporting services add-in, you get a web part, which allows you to view reports. You get some central administration components that allow you to manage those reports from within SharePoint, and also for site collection admins and for your sort of end users. You get sort of drop-down context-sensitive menus for managing those reports within SharePoint. So, editing reports, linking into Report Builder, managing the schedules for those reports, the caching, all those kinds of properties. You'll see some of those bits shortly. Notice the databases. With SharePoint integration mode, all of the reports are held in the content database just like any other document in SharePoint. So they're not held in the report server database. The report server database, it still exists, and it really manages that kind of back-end report scheduling and back-end processes for reporting. So if we look at a report server, as I said, it's a web server, it's not a database server. So the first kind of, I'd say, bad practice is that instantly administrators will go to their database server, install reporting services, and then essentially opening up, lots of HTTP traffic to your database server. It's an instance of reporting services, and you can have multiple instances, and it's really comprised of those components, and that's really kind of a very basic topology of a report server. So you've got an HTTP listener, listening for requests for reports, an authentication layer, and that could be Windows authentication, could be claims. And then you've got a report web service, which deals with all the traffic, that's the endpoint. The report manager component is really there for native mode reporting services. It's not required for SharePoint integration mode. SharePoint is the report manager. And then you've got some background processing components that deal with all of the report scheduling. The databases, as I mentioned, there's two databases, and there is an overlap. There is like a kind of in the middle, like a sync between content in your SharePoint content database and the report database that sits on SQL Server. And that's really for performance and for, again, those back-end processes when you've got, schedules of reports that don't go through SharePoint and they come directly to SQL Server. They want to access those reports directly from the database rather than going back up into SharePoint. And they're the kind of just the segregation. So the SharePoint content database really is the storage, the main storage point for all of your reports, data sources, and your security. So all your who can access which report is all configured within SharePoint, just like any other document library now. So we've got the report server, we've got the databases, and then you've got the SharePoint reporting services add-in. And that's really the glue that links the two technologies together, SQL Server and SharePoint together. And they're the kind of the components that it puts on each side. So on SharePoint, you've got an endpoint, like a web service proxy. There's the web part to view reports within SharePoint. And as I said, there's some application pages and configuration bits so that you can manage those reports from within SharePoint. And on the reporting services side, you've got some updates. You've got an endpoint on that side, and there's some custom extensions. So the add-in updates both products and allows them to really communicate and integrate. One thing to mention, the SharePoint 2010 application service architecture doesn't, reporting services doesn't follow that model. So it's not an app. You can't just go and create an application service for reporting services. Maybe that's something that will come in later versions as the integration becomes more tightly knit. But at the moment, essentially, this add-in is essentially your application service. So where do we start? So we start by building a report server. This can be you can either use one of your existing web front ends, your SharePoint web front ends, or it could be dedicated. And that really depends on, how much reporting services work your server is going to have to do. How many reports, how big is SQL Server reporting services in your organisation or the organisation that you're deploying to?
I've seen quite a few of them where a lot of clients want to put reporting services on app servers, so alongside things like Excel and Performance Point. Would you recommend doing that approach, or using it more like a web front end?
I would use it more like a web front end, because essentially, reporting services is a web front end. So especially if you're load balancing that and you've got an endpoint that you're exposing out, you really want. I would say it's a web front end component primarily rather than an application. That's just my preference. I've seen it done, but there's just more traffic going to your app servers then. Whereas, I see access for report almost the same as an access for a SharePoint page.
If you've got multiple web front ends, you need to install the reporting services on each.
Yeah, we'll come to that. So that's scale out and load balancing. That's sort further down the track. So you've got to think what technologies you're trying to join together. So which version of SharePoint have you got? Which version of SQL Server have you got? If you're lucky and you've got SharePoint 2010 and SQL 2008 R2, or you've got 2008 SQL Service Pack 2, then you're pretty much good to go. The installation and configuration of the reporting services add-in and the integration is a lot slicker. But if you're still on, if you're on MOS and you've got SQL Server 2005 or SQL Server 2008, then it's a lot more tricky. We'll come to a few of those pieces in a minute. So essentially, the report server is a SharePoint server, okay, even if it's dedicated. So it needs to have SharePoint installed, it needs to be the same build as the rest of your farm, because essentially you're going to connect that server to the farm. Okay, and it won't connect if you've got an old build or a different service pack. Or, for example, you've got Project Server on some other services, you need Project Server on this reporting server. And then you join to the farm. So you do that using the usual way with the configuration wizard or PowerShell. And obviously, wizards are evil. Do not let any wizard configure anything for you. And this goes for SharePoint and reporting services. There's no visibility of what's going on behind the scenes. And there's very little control. So I'd definitely recommend cancel all wizards and do things manually, or with script. So you could set one of these up with script, PowerShell. So once we've installed the SharePoint technologies, then we can install reporting services. You can do either way, actually, but I generally prefer to install SharePoint first, get that set up and configured, then install reporting services. So you'd go to your SQL Server install, you'd get to the features, you only want reporting services, and again, install but do not configure. These two are usually grayed out anyway if you're only installing that component. Again, just can't emphasise enough, don't let the wizards do that for you, because the wizards are evil. Okay, so I'm actually going to drop out now. So this is the configuration. So we've got our server, we've got everything installed. Now we're going to configure it. I'm actually going to drop out now into a virtual machine. So here's my report server. First thing we want to run is the reporting services configuration. Connect to the instance that we've just installed. And here you can see I've got a blank instance. So there's no database name there, there's no mode, but the service is started. Now, from my experience, there's a specific order of going through this left-hand side and configuring that, and it's not the order that you see there top to bottom. So the first thing I'll do is check the service account, and I would always, when you install SQL Server Reporting Services, I would always recommend you use a dedicated account. Even if it's on a one machine, it just helps in when you're troubleshooting error logs. You can see the account that's being called. If you were to later come and implement Kerberos, your SPNs are dedicated to this account. The next thing we do is we want to configure the database. So if this is a first server in our server farm, our first report server, we need to create a database. So we click the Change Database button, whether we're creating it or changing it. And we want to create a new database. Connect to our SQL Server instance. Notice here that it says specify credentials that have permission to connect to the server. But those credentials need a little bit more permission than just to connect to it. They actually need to be able to create a database. They need to be able to allocate security permissions to your report server service account. They need to run scripts. So you could actually, the simplest way to do this in practice is just to give that account sysadmin access on your report, on your database server, just for this period of time while it's running that script. We want to make sure we set the database in SharePoint integrated mode, because if we set it up in native mode, we can't go back. We have to recreate it. Provide the service account that we're going to use for SharePoint and the components to connect to the database. So from experience, to me, that's the role of the service account. So I leave it as the service account rather than specify something else. And then that goes through, that creates your two report server databases, allocates permissions to the reporting services service account on those, and sets up the schemas really for the databases. And if you get failures on this point, that's because you haven't got enough permissions on the account that's running this wizard, or the account that you've specified 3 steps back to actually connect and create these databases. Okay, so we've got our databases set up. The next thing is to connect to your web service URL.
Is that, I've seen that in the wizard before. Is that a part of the database where it says it's running in native mode?
Which?
On the previous screen it said native, but if you go back to where it says SharePoint integrated now.
This.
Yeah. I find that if you close the wizard and reopen it,
Yeah.
it'll say report server mode is now.
There's lots of bugs with the wizard, the configuration wizard. So one of the other bugs is scale out. It drives you nuts adding servers to the scale out through this option here, and they're not showing up. So you have to close the whole wizard down and reopen it again to get it to kick in. But yes, so if we do, there we go. So for our web service URL, now prior to SQL 2008, you would have to set up actual virtual directories in IIS to support this. When SQL 2008 came along, IIS was abandoned, and report servers was the listener is actually at a lower level now. It's directly listening on the http.sys sort of protocol area. So we need to create this. So for your first, notice the advanced button's grayed out. You won't get that advanced button enabled until you've actually created this with a sort of a server name, if you like. So if you've got a DNS or a host header for this, which you want to implement, you've actually got to set it up for your report server name. So this default name down here, this is my server name, port 80. You can obviously have different ports if you want, but essentially it's default web traffic. So it's either going to be port 80 or 443 for SSL. Okay, that's successful.
Given that, on the first slide you said potentially installing this on an existing web front end. Given it's got port listener for port 80 on the HTTP port, isn't that going to totally interfere if you try and start a default website in IIS?
No, because this reserves the URL before it even gets to IIS. So this is at a lower level than IIS. So if you reserve this report server URL here on port 80, any traffic to that will be trapped by report server before it even gets anywhere else, even to IIS. So obviously if you've got a SharePoint site that's on the same URL and you've got a SharePoint site collection or managed path that is called report server, then you're in trouble. So, another couple of managed points. But normally this would be something like reports.company.com, and that would be a dedicated DNS entry point just for reports. So we've set our web service up. If we click on that guy there, we're going to get an error because we've said it's SharePoint configurated, but we haven't actually integrated anything with SharePoint yet. So it's going to go off and try and find a SharePoint instance, but there's not enough information. And it's quite a decent error message, to be honest with you. It tells you exactly what's wrong. Okay, report manager URL, no need to touch that. SharePoint is your report manager. And if you configure this, it's not supported in report integrated mode. This is really for native mode. So this is the website where you would get your traditional report folders and configure your security and run reports from. You don't need that anymore. Email settings you would configure if you've got report schedules that want to run in the background during the night and email off those reports to various people. Execution account, that's again for running background processes under very low level permissions, but I've never come across a situation where I've needed to configure that. Encryption keys can get you a lot of grief. This is really kind of when reporting services is talking to anything to do with the database, the report server database, it's all kind of self-encrypted traffic, and it uses a key here to encrypt and decrypt those communications. And if you find that you've got errors, report servicing errors here at all, one of the quick, fast ways of cleaning that up is just delete that encrypted content and create a new key. And that normally solves quite a lot of issues with where you just can't connect to the report servers. And scale out we'll come back to in a second. Okay. So next we're going to install the add-in. So if you're lucky enough, like I said, you've got the latest versions of software, that's all done for you with the prerequisites when you install SharePoint 2010. If you've got different versions, it can be a bit of a nightmare as to which add-in you pick. And certainly before SharePoint 2010 came out, it was quite confusing as to which add-in you actually needed to select. If you're using MOS, depending on which version of SQL Server you've got. And if you actually go onto Microsoft Downloads, you can sort of see the various versions of the add-in that's available. So you've got to look at the dates as well on the right-hand side, give you a clue which is the latest version. So you've got the top one up there that says SQL Server 2008 Reporting Services Add-in. We've got another one down here, SQL Server 2008 Reporting Services Add-in. And don't trust it if it says this is for Windows SharePoint 3 or if it's SharePoint 2010, because I found that these kind of paraphrases, if you like, brief descriptions are not quite accurate. So, go back to our virtual machine, I'll go back to my central administration. So my add-in's all installed for me. And what you should get is, and again, it's quite clear there where reporting services configuration management is, isn't it? So if we go to general application settings, there we are. So you've got a few options here. First place to go to is reporting services integration. So this is where you're actually now going to do the actual final piece of the jigsaw, connect this SharePoint arm to report services. Well, that's chugging away. Before we get to this point, we could, if we've got more report servers to configure, so if we've got 2 or 3 or 4 in a scale out for load balancing, we can do those first 2 steps, do the installation and the configuration of reporting services on those servers ready. I would personally get all of that set up first before I then decided I was going to go to the add-in and connect them all together. So I'd actually get so if I had 2 report servers in a scale-out is managed by reporting services, not by SharePoint. So I would make sure that scale-out is working first before I then go to integrate. So here's our report service integration. So there's my URL in there. That's only popped in there because I've snapshotted this virtual machine, so it's gone backwards and that's in there. Normally that would be blank. And I would get that URL back from my report server configuration. That's the web service URL. You can't actually drag that or cut and paste that, which is nice. But up in my URL there, which I tried earlier, I can just cut and paste that. and put in here. So that's telling me where my web service URL is. Authentication mode. If you've just got NTLM, Windows NTLM security, you want to use that trusted account. And that effectively is like your unattended service account. So that's going to use your application pool account for the web application that you're configuring reporting services for. And that will pass that down ultimately to your data sources where you're going to report on. If you want per user security, so you want to pass the user's identity that's running the report right down to SQL Server, so you get data trimmed reports, you're going to need to switch that to Windows authentication, but you're also going to need to configure Kerberos, because it's expecting Kerberos and delegation to be set up and configured.
You can do that regardless of what data connection settings you've got in your report definition data source.
If you want to pass the identity down, yes. But if you're not worried about, so if you're, I mean, different organisations set this up differently. So some will have they'll create their reports. They'll create one report for the managers, and they'll create one report for the mortals. And they will separate that in SharePoint. So they'll have the report managers report, the managers report in a different SharePoint site, so you can't actually even get to the report, and that's enough for them. So they'll secure it at SharePoint level. Other organisations will want dashboards that are, one dashboard for all, but trimmed depending on who you are and what access you've got. If you want that kind of report, then you're going to need to configure something beyond, your Windows NTLM. You're going to need to configure Kerberos authentication. Credentials. So some credentials that has got admin rights on your report server. So it's got enough to actually make the changes, because this is the bit I mentioned that when you install the add-in, you've got some bits that are changes on the report server, some changes on SharePoint. So the bits that the changes on report server need to have admin access. So as soon as I set up a SharePoint install account with admin access, I can use that. And then I'm going to activate the features in my existing site collections. And I'll show you those features shortly. So it's also good practice or requirement really to make sure that your report service account has got some rights on your SharePoint content. And there's some PowerShell script that's the best way to do that, rather than go through and in each site and give your report services access to the content. Give it some blanket access, and then it's done. So that's done. We've got some green lights, which is good. Gives you quite a good idea of what it's actually done there. And we're good to go as far as reporting services configuration. That's it. There are some other options on here. So if we did have scale out, we need to add our other servers. So if we have got two servers, we need to add the other one manually via that option. So I need to click on here, provide the server name, and the instance of reporting services. Yeah.
What's the feature enabled in all the site collections in all the web apps? On the part? Or?
I can show you, yeah. So, different features. So when you install the add-in, you get some site collection features for central administration. So that's really the extra options in central admin. And
Features will be available to all the site collections in all the web applications that you have in your farm by default?
this is just the central administration features. Okay, so I'm just explain that this is what the add-in, when you install the add-in, that's what the add-in provides you. Now, sometimes if you install the add-in, the activation of this feature doesn't work. So you might install the add-in, and in central admin, you might not see those options. So you could come in here and just activate those features manually. So I have seen that on certain versions where that hasn't kicked in. But in your site collections, so in your content site collections, so here's just a SharePoint site collection. If I go to site collection features here, I've got this reporting server integration feature. So this provides the content types for your report data sources and report documents. So now within, so here I've got a standard document library. And I've added those two content types. So those content types are provided by that feature. And then within my library, this is a report. So I get all the context-sensitive options now for that particular report. So cache options, report history, subscriptions. I can edit directly in Report Builder. So if we go back to our error here and we refresh this, that's good. So that shows us all of the areas, site collections and libraries within SharePoint where I've got reports, where those features have been activated. And that's almost like the old style report server URL if you was in native mode. You'd see that kind of thing.
So you would never actually go to that URL yourself now?
That's just a check. That's just a sanity check. Sanity check. So if I go here and I've got errors, so I've got, for example, some common issues. So I might see something like this. So this is actually trying to load version 12 of SharePoint. That's trying to connect to 2007. So therefore, I've got the wrong add-in installed somewhere. I've got the add-in that thinks I'm trying to connect to Windows SharePoint Services 3. That's a sanity check. That's good. When you're at that point, you're good to go then. Your next task might be to add a report server in scale-out mode. So the process for that would be, okay, so this might be my new report server, install SharePoint, install SQL reporting services, configure, but this time in my database, this time I can choose an existing database to connect to. So a scale-out is one or more servers connecting and using the same report server database. So I'd find my again. I need a. This is probably more accurate because I need to have some credentials that just need to connect to that server and pull back the databases, and then I can find my report server for me and add to that. And then once I've done that, so I've created my instance, configured it, connected to the existing database, I can then go down to the scale out deployment. And from the one which you set up initially, your number one server, you can then add your second server. If you go to this screen on your second server, you won't see anything at all. You need to go to your first server and add the server from there. And then you'll get, this table will expand and you'll get multiple rows per, and you'll see the status as joined.
For each of those, you need a SharePoint license as well as SQL license.
Yes. Well, you see, if the licensing for reporting services is covered with your SQL license, so on the reporting services side, you're only installing, you're not incurring additional licenses there. But on the SharePoint, yes. If you want that scale out, you've got another SharePoint server license to consider. So if you're an enterprise SharePoint.
Do the reporting services web files allow you to point to web report definitions that are stored in a different file?
Good question.
Can you repeat the question?
So, can you point at RDL files from a different farm? So you've got two farms. Just for showing the reports.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see why not.
Because I'm thinking you could probably have a foundation farm to run SQL for services in, so you don't have to pay for any licenses. But then render them in an enterprise farm where you've got other enterprise features let up.
You could do.
You don't have to SharePoint license your reporting services file.
You could do, but like anything, Microsoft's cover themselves by saying if you're consuming that information, then you're likely to incur or you need some kind of connector license or for that.
Yeah, just that you're not consuming an enterprise feature.
No, but reporting services is not an enterprise feature.
Exactly.
Yeah, true. Okay. Okay, let's just quickly go through some topologies then. So you could have everything on one box. I've seen that in schools, colleges, where server resource is limited. There are not that many users using reporting services. I've seen that set up, and it's run quite happily on a single box. But the thing is, with SharePoint 2010 technologies, that single box needs to be big. That needs to be, really 16 gig of RAM, and sufficient to run all of those technologies on one server. Obviously, you've got no redundancy. You've got a single point of failure, but it's sufficient in some organisations. I've seen this where we've got two reports. A dedicated report server. So we've got down the left we've got our traditional SharePoint distributed hierarchy, and that could be, I've just got one set of servers there, but that could be load balance everything. You could have your 6 server farm there, for example, and then one additional report server. So you're offloading that report service. So if you've got, reporting services are quite heavily used, offload that to a separate server. I've also seen this quite common as well, where reporting services, 2 instances of reporting services are added to your web front ends. So your web front ends are running the web front end role and the reporting services role and incoming email, and that's it. And you load balance, so scale out reporting services, you'd create a load balanced virtual IP which you'd map to a DNS name, and you would have something like reports.company.com which will be handled by your report services, and then obviously your website.company.com will be handled by SharePoint. That's probably, in a distributed environment, that's probably the most common that I've seen, and it's quite acceptable, and it it runs quite nicely. And if you look at the just something to point out within Central Admin. So in this farm, I've got my dedicated report server. The only service I've got running on there is the timer service. It's joined to the farm, but it's not actually running the web server role. It's completely dedicated, and it's only got that timer service on there to pick up any health check jobs or background SharePoint processing. So you could be careful if you're setting it up as a dedicated report server. You don't want that web front end role on there. Yeah, sure.
You know that many of the third-party products are licensed by the web front end. Yeah, like Lintex or any other.
Yeah.
If we put a dedicated SSRS server, would that count as a web front end for licensing of third parties or not?
Not for reporting services, but you would incur a license for SharePoint.
Yeah, for SharePoint, yes. But
Yeah.
it wouldn't count as another front end
No,
because you don't enable that service anymore.
Yeah. So you saw just then that I'd switched that web application role off. So it's not a SharePoint web front end, but it does need to be connected to the farm. So it is listed, but it's not. So if you had web parts, for example, you wouldn't need to install them on there, no. But if you didn't, if you added the report server, created the role, and you left that service running, then you can run into problems, especially if you've got your key web front ends load balanced and you've got this other kind of rogue SharePoint web front end as well. So scale out, I've covered most of that.
Do you use round robin DNS as well as?
Yeah. Thing is with DNS and load balancing reporting services, load balancing only load balances the server or the HTTP traffic. It doesn't load balance reporting services for you. That's done via the scale out. So you need to configure the scale out for that through reporting services, not through SharePoint.
So with the scale out, even if you send all your traffic to one of the servers, it's still the server loaded back in.
Yeah. So quickly, kind of running about out of time a bit, but again, just cover some authentication options. So NTLM is the most common. A lot of people don't want to touch Kerberos or claims yet. They just want to set this thing up. And if it means, consolidating everything on one box to use NTLM or to use the service account to connect to your data sources, then so be it. That's fine, and we'll manage that in some other way. That's pretty common. But a lot of organisations these days are becoming more advanced with BI, so they do want, user-centric data or user-trimmed data, and have, different roles accessing the same dashboards, and expecting different data back, and have the knowledge or the comfort blanket that is secure at the back end. Now, if you want to do that, you need to configure Kerberos. And it's not really as tricky as it seems. This is kind of, Kerberos comes from the Greek, like mythical creature, Cerberus, the kind of evil creature, but there's kind of rumours that that's where the name Kerberos came from. But it's not as evil as it seems. It's really planning. You might have to make sure that you set aside enough time for planning for this. and have your Active Directory guy sat there with you, or, if not, armed with a camera so he can take pictures of what he's doing. There've been so many times I've sat on the other side, either you have a central organisation manage all your Active Directory and network infrastructure, like a informatics service or something, and they're all locked away behind iron gates and telling you, yeah, we've done that, and you're there 2 days trying to configure something, and turns out they haven't done it at all. So get those guys sat in a room, or if not, make sure they take screenshots of what they're doing and send you that. So there's the steps. I won't go through that now, but I'll make my slides available, and I'll blog some of this stuff as well. Key thing is that reporting service is a little bit bitty, so there are still some config files that you need to update. Claims is supported. It's not native with reporting services, but you can configure claims, and I've configured forms-based authentication to reporting services before, and actually used like some parameters as the login. So, for example, like an insurance, a driver, for example, who comes on board wants a report on his particular claim, he might enter his claim ID and a password rather than a user ID, and that would enough to authenticate him and show him his report. There's a couple of ways of authenticating and showing your report at the same time. But be aware that report builder and bids don't support some variation of claims. So you're okay with forms-based, but there's no support for SAML or Windows Live. So you can't have report authors logging on with a Windows Live account creating reports. Anonymous access, again, is something that's not supported. So, some problems there if you want to expose your reports to the web. You have to really do some kind of workarounds, like pre-render it first and show it as something like a PDF file, or consume it from another web app where you're doing the authentication and you almost got like a window into that. So a few common issues. As I mentioned, I've kind of gone over these actually, but you install the add-in, you go to central admin, there's nothing there. That's likely that for some reason that feature hasn't been activated, so you've got to go in and go to central administration, go to your site settings and site collection features and activate that feature manually, and then you'll go to central admin and you'll get those 3 options. It used to be that reporting services only worked if your web application was configured in the default zone. So if you had an extranet scenario where you've extended that and you've got an extranet zone or an intranet zone, those reports won't work. But that's all been sorted now with those latest versions of the add-ins. That's really if you're still on SharePoint 2007 and older versions of SQL Server, you're going to run into those problems. That one we've kind of covered, so that's really another one that I've installed the 32-bit add-in on a 64-bit machine before. It doesn't like that. Lets you do it, but when you come to configure it, you get all sorts of problems. And a kind of a 6 hours later, when you're 4 in the morning and you suddenly twig, so you're kicking yourself. It pretty much covers everything. There's my contact details there if you want to get hold of me for any further questions. There's some good resources there. That white paper on Kerberos is absolutely superb. I've used that not just for reporting services but for Performance Point, some of the other BI solutions. That's a really good resource. And MSN's pretty good for reporting services integration. Any questions?